The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Naval Base San Diego as Petty Officer Marcus Thompson wiped sweat from his forehead. The temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees, and it was barely 8 in the morning. Marcus had been stationed at the base for 3 years, long enough to know every corner, every routine, and every face that belonged there. He prided himself on being the unofficial welcome committee for new recruits, though his version of welcoming often involved pranks that had become legendary among the enlisted personnel. As he walked past the main administrative building, Marcus spotted an unfamiliar figure struggling with an oversized duffel bag near the entrance. The person wore crisp new Navy utilities that practically screamed, "Fresh out of boot camp." From behind, Marcus could see the individual was smaller in stature, with short cropped hair barely visible beneath a regulation cap. The way they fumbled with the heavy bag and kept checking a piece of paper in their hand confirmed Marcus's suspicion. This was definitely a rookie, having their first day jitters. Marcus grinned to himself as he remembered his own first day 3 years ago. He had been just as nervous, just as eager to make a good impression. But the senior personnel had made sure to knock him down a peg or two with their own brand of military humor. It was tradition, really, a rite of passage that every new sailor had to endure. The pranks were harmless, designed to break the ice and teach newcomers not to take themselves too seriously. The idea struck him like lightning. Just 20 feet away sat the maintenance shed where the groundskeeping crew stored their equipment. Marcus had noticed earlier that they had left a large bucket filled with soapy water outside after washing one of the vehicles. The bucket sat perfectly positioned near the walkway, almost as if fate had placed it there for this exact moment. Marcus quickly formulated his plan. He would approach the newcomer under the pretense of offering help, then accidentally splash them with the sudsy water. It was a classic move that had worked countless times before. The rookie would get soaked. Everyone would have a good laugh, and then Marcus would help them get cleaned up while explaining that this was just how things worked around here. By lunchtime, the incident would become a funny story that the newcomer could share with others. He casually strolled toward the bucket, keeping his movements natural and unhurried. The base was bustling with morning activity, sailors heading to various duties, officers walking briskly between buildings, and the general hum of military life in full swing. No one paid particular attention to Marcus as he positioned himself near the maintenance shed. The rookie was still struggling with their bag, now attempting to hoist it onto their shoulder. While balancing what appeared to be several important documents, they seemed completely absorbed in their task, unaware of their surroundings or the mischievous plan forming nearby. Marcus could see beads of perspiration on the back of their neck, evidence of both the heat and the stress of their first-day nerves. Marcus bent down and gripped the handle of the bucket. The water was still relatively clean, just soapy enough to create a dramatic splash without causing any real damage. He had done this enough times to know that while the initial shock would be significant, no harm would come to the person or their belongings. Military uniforms were designed to get dirty and wet. They would dry quickly in this heat. Taking a deep breath, Marcus lifted the bucket and called out in a friendly voice, "Hey there, need some help with that bag?" As the figure turned around, Marcus swung the bucket in a wide arc, sending a cascade of soapy water flying through the air. The water caught the sunlight for a brief moment, creating tiny rainbows in the droplets before splashing directly across the newcomer's chest and face. The reaction was immediate, and exactly what Marcus had expected. The person stumbled backward, gasping in shock as the cold water hit them. Their carefully organized papers scattered in the breeze, and their pristine uniform was now soaked and dripping. Water ran down their face and onto the ground, creating a small puddle around their feet. Marcus burst into laughter, already reaching into his pocket for the towel he always carried for just such occasions. "Welcome to San Diego," he called out cheerfully, expecting to see the mix of surprise and grudging amusement that usually followed his pranks. "Don't worry, this happens to everyone on their first day. It's like a baptism into base life." But as the water cleared from the person's face and they removed their now soggy cap, Marcus felt his laughter die in his throat. Standing before him, dripping wet but maintaining perfect military bearing despite the situation, was a woman. Her short hair was plastered to her head, and water dripped steadily from her chin onto her soaked uniform. Her expression was not one of amusement or even anger. It was something far more unsettling. It was the calm, measured look of someone used to command. Marcus suddenly noticed details he had missed before. The woman's uniform, while wet, bore insignia that made his blood run cold. Even through the water stains, he could make out the distinct markings that indicated this was not a new recruit at all. The confidence in her posture, the way she stood despite being thoroughly soaked, and most importantly, the rank insignia on her collar told a story that made Marcus's stomach drop like a stone. He had just drenched an officer, not just any officer, but someone whose rank was clearly far above his own pay grade. Admiral Sarah Chen stood motionless for several seconds, water continuing to drip from her uniform onto the concrete below. At 42, she had seen almost everything the Navy could throw at her during her 24 years of service. But being doused with a bucket of soapy water on her first morning at a new command was certainly a first. She had arrived at Naval Base San Diego just hours earlier, having driven through the night from her previous posting in Norfolk, Virginia. Marcus felt as though time had slowed to a crawl. His eyes frantically scanned the woman's uniform, taking in details that should have been obvious from the beginning. The service ribbons on her chest told the story of a distinguished career spanning multiple deployments and commands. Her bearing, even while soaked, spoke of years of leadership experience. Most importantly, the eagle insignia on her collar confirmed his worst fears. This was not just any officer, but a captain at minimum. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had spent 3 years building a reputation as the base's unofficial prankster, always careful to target only new enlisted personnel or junior officers who would take the jokes in good spirit. He had never, not once, made the mistake of targeting someone so far above his rank. The military hierarchy was sacred, and he had just violated it in the most spectacular way possible. Admiral Chen slowly wiped water from her eyes and looked directly at Marcus. Her gaze was steady and unreadable, giving no hint of her thoughts or intentions. She had been looking forward to a quiet arrival at her new command, hoping to observe the base operations for a few hours before formally announcing her presence. That plan had clearly gone out the window along with her dry uniform. "Petty officer," she said quietly, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command despite the circumstances. "I assume this is some sort of tradition I should be aware of." Marcus's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. His brain seemed to have completely shut down, unable to process the magnitude of his error. The towel in his hand felt suddenly useless. What was a small hand towel against the damage he had just done to his career? He could already envision the disciplinary hearing, the reduction in rank, possibly even discharge from the Navy he had worked so hard to serve. Around them, the normal bustle of base activity continued, though Marcus noticed several sailors had stopped to stare at the unusual scene. Word would spread quickly through the base's gossip network. Nothing traveled faster than news of someone making a spectacular mistake. By noon, every person on base would know that some idiot had soaked a high-ranking officer. Admiral Chen bent down to collect her scattered papers, now soggy and beginning to blur with running ink. Among them was her official transfer order, appointment letter to command Naval Base San Diego, and her prepared remarks for the ceremony scheduled for later that week. The irony was not lost on her. She had been reviewing those very documents when the impromptu shower had begun. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "Ma'am, I thought you were—" He stopped, realizing that any explanation would only make things worse. There was no acceptable excuse for what he had done. The fact that he had mistaken a senior officer for a new recruit was damning enough without adding details about his planned prank. "You thought I was a new sailor reporting for duty?" Admiral Chen finished for him, straightening up with her rescued papers clutched in her hands. Despite the water damage, she handled them with care, as if they were still important documents rather than soggy reminders of the morning's disaster. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of base operations and the steady drip of water from Admiral Chen's uniform. Marcus found himself studying her face, trying to gauge her reaction. He had seen angry officers before, had witnessed the explosive fury that could erupt when military protocols were violated. But this was different. Admiral Chen's expression remained calm, almost contemplative, as if she were working through a complex problem rather than dealing with an obvious disciplinary issue. What Marcus couldn't know was that Admiral Chen was indeed working through a problem, though not the one he expected. She had been specifically chosen for this command because of her reputation for innovative leadership and her ability to connect with enlisted personnel. Her superiors had made it clear that they wanted someone who could bridge the gap between the traditional military hierarchy and the modern Navy's need for adaptability and crew morale. In her previous commands, Admiral Chen had made it a point to understand the informal culture of each base, the traditions and relationships that existed beneath the official structure. She knew that pranks and practical jokes were a time-honored tradition in military life, serving as both stress relief and a way to build camaraderie among service members. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. Here she was, trying to make a quiet entrance to observe and understand her new command, and instead she had been inadvertently thrust into the middle of what was clearly an established base tradition. The young petty officer standing before her, still frozen in horror, represented something important, the informal leadership that kept morale high and crews functioning effectively. Admiral Chen made a decision that would surprise everyone involved, including herself. Instead of immediately calling for the shore patrol or demanding to know Marcus's chain of command, she did something unexpected. She smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it was there nonetheless. "Petty officer," she said, her voice taking on a slightly different tone. "In the future, you might want to verify your target's rank before launching your welcoming committee activities." She gestured to her soaked uniform. "Though I have to admit, this is certainly the most memorable arrival I've ever had." Marcus blinked several times, certain he had misheard. The smile on the Admiral's face was small but unmistakably real, and her tone, while still carrying the authority of her rank, had lost some of its formality. He had been preparing himself for the worst possible outcome, and instead found himself facing something completely unexpected: understanding, perhaps even amusement. "Ma'am," Marcus stammered, finally finding enough voice to speak, "I cannot express how sorry I am. There is absolutely no excuse for what just happened. I should have looked more carefully, should have confirmed who you were before." He trailed off again, realizing that explaining his prank would not improve the situation. Admiral Chen held up a hand, water still dripping from her sleeve. "Petty officer, what's your name?" "Thompson, ma'am." "Marcus Thompson." He stood straighter, falling into proper military bearing despite the surreal nature of the conversation. "Well, Petty Officer Thompson, I suspect this little incident tells me more about life on this base than any briefing I was scheduled to receive." She looked around at the gathering crowd of curious onlookers, noting how they maintained a respectful distance while obviously straining to hear every word of the conversation. Marcus followed her gaze and felt his embarrassment deepen. Half the morning shift seemed to have found reasons to walk past this particular spot, and he could see phones being discreetly pulled out to capture the scene. By evening, photos of the soaked Admiral would probably be circulating through social media, assuming his career lasted long enough for him to care about such things. What neither Marcus nor the gathering crowd knew was that Admiral Chen had specifically requested this assignment. Naval Base San Diego had a reputation for high morale and strong crew cohesion, but recent reports had suggested that the relationship between enlisted personnel and officers had become somewhat strained. Her predecessor had been an old-school commander who believed in strict hierarchical separation, and while discipline remained strong, the informal networks that made military life bearable had suffered. Admiral Chen had built her career on understanding that effective military leadership required more than just following regulations. She had commanded ships where enlisted sailors would go the extra mile, not because they were ordered to, but because they respected and trusted their leadership. She had learned that the best crews were those where appropriate humor and camaraderie existed alongside military discipline. "Tell me, Petty Officer Thompson," she continued, wringing water from the hem of her uniform jacket, "how long have you been stationed here?" 3 years. "Ma'am." Marcus was still trying to process the fact that he was having a normal conversation instead of being marched to the brig. "And this welcoming committee tradition, is it something you established, or were you carrying on something that was already in place?" Marcus hesitated. He could throw his fellow sailors under the bus, explain that pranks were a long-standing tradition on the base, or he could take full responsibility and protect others from potential disciplinary action. Despite his current predicament, the choice was easy. "Ma'am, this was entirely my own stupid idea. Nobody else was involved, and I take full responsibility for my actions." Admiral Chen nodded approvingly. Loyalty to one's shipmates was a quality she valued highly, and Thompson's willingness to shield others despite his own vulnerability spoke well of his character. She had dealt with enough military personnel over the years to recognize genuine remorse when she saw it, and she could see that this young petty officer was genuinely horrified by what had happened. "I appreciate your honesty, Petty Officer Thompson." She looked down at her soaked uniform and laughed, a genuine sound that surprised everyone within earshot, including herself. "Though I have to say, your timing could use some work. I was hoping to observe base operations quietly for a few hours before making my presence known officially." The laughter broke something in the tension that had been building since the incident began. Marcus felt his shoulders relax slightly, though he remained at attention. Around them, the crowd of onlookers seemed to collectively exhale, sensing that this situation might not end in the disaster they had all anticipated. "Ma'am, if I may ask," Marcus ventured carefully, "what is your actual position here on base?" He had confirmed that she was a high-ranking officer, but the specific nature of her assignment remained unclear. Admiral Chen's smile widened slightly. "As of tomorrow, Petty Officer Thompson, I will be officially taking command of Naval Base San Diego. Today, I was supposed to be conducting an informal assessment of base operations and personnel morale." She gestured to her dripping uniform. "I'd say your little demonstration has given me quite an insight into both." The words hit Marcus like a second bucket of water, though this time the sensation was purely metaphorical. He had not just pranked any officer. He had soaked the incoming commanding officer of the entire base, the woman who would ultimately be responsible for every aspect of life for the thousands of personnel stationed there, the person whose leadership would affect his daily existence for however long she remained in command. Around them, the crowd had grown larger, and Marcus could hear the whispered conversations as word spread about the identity of the soaked officer. He realized that this story would become legendary on the base, though whether it would be remembered as a humorous incident or a cautionary tale would depend entirely on what happened next. Admiral Chen seemed to be considering something, her eyes moving from Marcus to the crowd and back again. She had spent the drive from Norfolk thinking about how to establish herself as an approachable leader, while maintaining the respect necessary for effective command. Traditional military protocol suggested that this incident should result in formal disciplinary action, but her instincts told her that this might be an opportunity to send a different kind of message to her new crew. Admiral Chen looked around at the growing crowd of spectators, many of whom were trying to appear busy while obviously listening to every word of the conversation. She recognized the moment for what it was, a defining incident that would set the tone for her entire command. How she handled this situation would be discussed in every break room, mess hall, and barracks on base for months to come. "Petty Officer Thompson," she said, her voice carrying clearly enough for the surrounding sailors to hear, "I have a proposal for you." Marcus felt his stomach lurch. A proposal from the commanding officer could mean anything from extra duties to a transfer to the most undesirable assignment the Navy had to offer. "Yes, ma'am? It seems to me that you know this base and its personnel quite well. You've been here for 3 years, you understand the informal networks and traditions." Admiral Chen paused, wringing more water from her sleeve. "I was planning to spend the next few days observing operations quietly, getting a feel for how things really work here. Instead, I find myself in the unique position of having been thoroughly introduced to base culture in the most direct way possible." She stepped closer to Marcus, lowering her voice slightly but still speaking clearly enough for others to hear. "I'm going to make you an offer, Petty Officer Thompson. You can show me around this base, give me the real tour, not the sanitized version I'd get from my staff. Show me how things actually work here, where the real problems are, what the crew actually thinks about their leadership and their assignments." Marcus's eyes widened. This was so far from any outcome he had imagined that he wondered if he might be hallucinating. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand." "You made a mistake today," Admiral Chen continued, "but it was born out of a desire to welcome what you thought was a new member of our crew. That tells me something about your character and about the culture of this base. I'd rather channel that energy into something productive than waste it on formal disciplinary action." Around them, Marcus could see sailors exchanging glances and whispered comments. The story spreading through the crowd was no longer about a petty officer who had made a career-ending mistake, but about a commanding officer who was handling an unprecedented situation with unexpected grace and creativity. However, Admiral Chen's tone became more formal. There are conditions. First, this arrangement is temporary, 1 week only. After that, we return to normal military protocol and chain of command. Second, your regular duties continue unchanged. This is in addition to your normal responsibilities, not instead of them. Third, absolute honesty. If I ask you a question, I expect a straight answer, regardless of whether you think it's what I want to hear. Marcus found himself nodding before he fully processed what he was agreeing to. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Good. Now I believe the first order of business is for me to get into a dry uniform. Admiral Chen looked down at her soaked clothing with amusement. I assume there's somewhere on base where I can accomplish that. Yes, ma'am. The BOQ has laundry facilities, and there's also the uniform shop near the exchange if you need replacements. Marcus was still trying to wrap his head around the surreal turn the morning had taken. Excellent. While I'm getting cleaned up, I want you to think about where we should start this tour. I'm particularly interested in seeing the areas where enlisted personnel spend their off-duty time, the maintenance facilities, and anywhere else you think would give me an accurate picture of daily life here. As Admiral Chen turned to leave, she paused and looked back at Marcus. Oh, and Petty Officer Thompson, next time you feel the urge to welcome a newcomer to the base, you might want to check their rank insignia first. A simple, "Can I help you?" works just as well and involves significantly less risk to your career. The crowd finally began to disperse as Admiral Chen walked toward the bachelor officer's quarters, her soggy documents clutched in one hand and water still dripping from her uniform. Marcus remained standing where she had left him, trying to process everything that had just happened. Senior Chief Petty Officer Maria Rodriguez, who had been watching the entire incident from nearby, approached Marcus with a mixture of amazement and concern on her face. Rodriguez had been on the base for 8 years and had never seen anything quite like what had just transpired. "Thompson," she said quietly, "do you have any idea what just happened here?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "Not really, Senior Chief. I thought my career was over. And instead I somehow ended up as the new Admiral's tour guide." "That woman," Rodriguez said, watching Admiral Chen's retreating figure, "just turned what should have been a major disciplinary incident into a leadership opportunity. I've never seen anything like it." She paused, studying Marcus carefully. "She's giving you a chance to redeem yourself, but don't think for a second that this means you're off the hook. You've got 1 week to prove that her faith in you isn't misplaced." Marcus nodded soberly. The initial relief of avoiding immediate punishment was giving way to the realization that he now faced a different kind of pressure. Admiral Chen had essentially made him her unofficial liaison to the enlisted crew, a position that came with enormous responsibility and potential for both success and failure. "Senior Chief," Marcus said slowly, "what do you know about her, about Admiral Chen?" Rodriguez smiled grimly. "I know she's got a reputation for being tough but fair, and for actually listening to her crew. I also know that the last 2 commanding officers she replaced saw significant improvements in morale and efficiency." She fixed Marcus with a stern look. "Don't screw this up, Thompson. This could be good for all of us, but only if you handle it right." As Marcus walked back toward his assigned duty station, he reflected on the bizarre turn his morning had taken. Less than an hour ago, he had been a petty officer known mainly for his pranks and his ability to make new sailors feel welcome in his own unconventional way. Now he found himself in a position where his actions could influence the relationship between the base's leadership and its crew for years to come. 3 hours later, Admiral Chen appeared at Marcus's workstation in the communications building wearing a crisp, dry uniform and carrying a small notebook. She had spent the time not only changing clothes but also making several phone calls to delay her official meetings and reviewing the personnel files for the base's key enlisted leaders, including Marcus Thompson. His record painted an interesting picture. 3 years of solid performance evaluations, multiple commendations for technical expertise, and notably, several informal mentions of his positive impact on crew morale. His supervisors consistently noted his ability to help new personnel integrate into base life, though they diplomatically omitted details about his methods. "Ready for that tour, Petty Officer Thompson?" Admiral Chen asked, approaching his workstation where he was running diagnostics on communication equipment. Marcus immediately stood at attention. "Yes, ma'am. I've given some thought to places you might want to see." He had spent the entire morning thinking about little else, trying to determine how to show Admiral Chen the real base without highlighting problems that might reflect poorly on his fellow sailors. Excellent. Lead the way. Their first stop was the enlisted mess hall where the lunch crowd was beginning to gather. Marcus had timed this deliberately. He wanted Admiral Chen to see the facility when it was actively being used, not during the sterile emptiness of off hours. As they entered, conversations gradually quieted as sailors noticed their commanding officer's presence. "This is where most of the enlisted crew eats," Marcus explained, then added honestly, "The food's actually pretty good, though there's always complaints about the coffee." Admiral Chen nodded, making notes as she observed the interactions between personnel. She noticed how different rank groups naturally segregated themselves at different tables, but also saw evidence of cross-rank friendships and mentoring relationships. The facility was clean and well-maintained, though she could see areas where wear and tear were beginning to show. "Tell me about the complaints," she said quietly as they walked through the serving area. Marcus hesitated, then remembered her instruction about absolute honesty. "The coffee's been weak for about 6 months. The equipment's old and needs replacement, but it's not considered a priority. Some of the guys have started bringing their own coffee makers to the barracks, which is technically against regulations, but nobody enforces it." Admiral Chen made another note. "What else?" "The evening meal service ends at 1900, but we've got personnel working shifts that don't get off until 2000 or later. They either have to eat cold leftovers or find something from the vending machines." Marcus paused, then added, "It's especially hard on the single sailors who don't have access to cooking facilities." As they moved through the base, Marcus found himself relaxing into his role as guide and interpreter. Admiral Chen asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to his answers, never interrupting or dismissing his observations. When he showed her the recreation facilities, he explained which equipment was popular and which sat unused. When they visited the maintenance shops, he introduced her to the senior petty officers who actually ran the day-to-day operations. Chief Petty Officer James Walker, a 20-year veteran who supervised the vehicle maintenance bay, was initially intimidated by the Admiral's presence but quickly warmed up when he realized she was genuinely interested in hearing about his operation. Marcus watched as Admiral Chen spent 20 minutes learning about parts supply issues and the creative solutions Walker's team had developed to keep vehicles operational despite budget constraints. "Chief Walker," Admiral Chen said as they prepared to leave the maintenance bay, "I'd like you to prepare a brief report on your part situation. Nothing formal, just a summary of what you need and what workarounds you're currently using."
"Can you have that to me by Friday?"
Walker's eyes lit up. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely." As they walked away, Marcus realized he was witnessing something unusual. Admiral Chen wasn't just conducting a tour. She was actively gathering intelligence about the real operational status of the base, information that likely never made it into official reports. Their next stop was the recreation center, where off-duty personnel gathered to work out, play games, or simply relax. The facility showed its age, with equipment that had seen better days and spaces that clearly needed renovation. But it was also obvious that the crew had worked hard to maintain what they had, organizing equipment efficiently and keeping the areas clean despite the wear. "This is where people come to blow off steam," Marcus explained. "The basketball court's popular, and we've got a pretty competitive softball league that runs during the summer months. The weight room equipment is old but functional." Admiral Chen spent several minutes talking with sailors who were using the facilities, asking about their experiences and listening to suggestions for improvements. Marcus noticed that she had a talent for putting people at ease, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere curiosity. One young sailor, barely out of boot camp, nervously mentioned that the recreation center's hours didn't always align well with shift schedules. "Sometimes when you get off a 12-hour watch, you just want to work out to clear your head, but the facility's already closed." "What time would work better?" Admiral Chen asked. The conversation that followed revealed a pattern Marcus had never fully recognized. Many of the base's policies and schedules had been designed around traditional daytime operations, but the reality of modern naval operations required much more flexibility in work schedules. Personnel working evening and night shifts often found themselves out of sync with base services and recreational opportunities. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself seeing his own workplace through new eyes. Admiral Chen's questions highlighted issues he had accepted as simply the way things are, but which actually represented opportunities for improvement. Her approach was not to criticize existing conditions, but to understand how they affected the crew's daily lives and operational effectiveness. Their final stop was the barracks complex where single enlisted personnel lived. Marcus had been dreading this part of the tour, knowing that the accommodations were adequate but far from impressive. The buildings were old, the rooms small, and privacy was minimal. But Admiral Chen surprised him by spending time talking with residents about their living conditions and what improvements would make the biggest difference in their quality of life. The rooms are small, one petty officer second class explained. But honestly, the biggest issue is the common areas. There's nowhere to really relax or socialize except your room, and that doesn't work when you've got a roommate who's on a different schedule. Admiral Chen made extensive notes during this conversation, asking detailed questions about storage space, study areas, and recreational facilities within the barracks complex. Marcus realized she was building a comprehensive picture of enlisted life on the base, gathering information that would inform decisions about everything from budget priorities to policy changes. 7 days later, Marcus stood in Admiral Chen's office wearing his dress blue uniform and feeling more nervous than he had since the infamous bucket incident. The week had passed quickly, filled with tours, conversations, and countless questions from his fellow sailors about the Admiral's intentions and observations. Word had spread throughout the base about their unconventional arrangement, and Marcus had found himself in the unusual position of being both envied and pitied by his peers. Admiral Chen sat behind her desk, reviewing the notebook she had filled during their week together. The office was now fully organized, with personal touches that made it clear she intended to be here for an extended period. Photos of previous command's commendations and a small collection of books on leadership filled the shelves behind her desk. Petty Officer Thompson, she began, looking up from her notes. This has been an educational week. Marcus remained at attention. Yes, ma'am. At ease. Admiral Chen gestured to the chair across from her desk. I want to talk to you about what I learned and about what happens next. As Marcus seated himself, Admiral Chen opened a folder containing what appeared to be official documents. First, let me address the elephant in the room. Your little welcoming committee incident last Monday was a clear violation of military protocol. Under normal circumstances, it would result in formal disciplinary action. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had known this moment would come. But the week of normal interactions had allowed him to hope that perhaps the incident would be overlooked entirely. However, Admiral Chen continued, the past week has given me insight into both your character and the culture of this base that I could not have gained through conventional means. Your willingness to take responsibility for your actions, your loyalty to your fellow sailors, and your genuine knowledge of base operations have all been valuable assets. She pulled out a document and slid it across the desk to Marcus. This is a letter of counseling regarding the incident last Monday. It acknowledges that your actions were inappropriate, but notes that no formal disciplinary action is being taken due to the unique circumstances and your cooperation in correcting the situation. Marcus picked up the document and read it quickly. The language was formal but fair, clearly documenting the incident without destroying his career prospects. A letter of counseling was essentially a warning, serious enough to be noted in his record but not severe enough to impact promotions or assignments significantly. Thank you, ma'am, Marcus said quietly. I know I didn't deserve this consideration. Admiral Chen smiled slightly. Perhaps not initially, but you've earned it over the past week. She leaned back in her chair. Now let's talk about the future. The tour you've given me has highlighted several areas where improvements could be made to both operational efficiency and crew morale. I'm going to be implementing some changes, and I want your input on how to do so effectively. She opened her notebook and began reading from a list. Extended mess hall hours to accommodate shift workers, upgraded coffee equipment, expanded recreation center hours with a staffing solution that doesn't impact operational readiness, common area improvements in the barracks complex, better alignment between base services and actual operational schedules. Marcus listened with growing amazement. Every issue he had mentioned during their tours was represented on her list, along with several others he hadn't thought to bring up. These changes will require buy-in from the crew to be successful, Admiral Chen continued. I've learned that informal leadership networks are just as important as official chains of command in making improvements work. That's where you come in. She pulled out another document. I'm creating an enlisted advisory committee, a formal group that will meet monthly to discuss quality of life issues and operational concerns. The committee will have representatives from different ratings and experience levels, and it will report directly to me. Marcus waited, unsure where this was leading. I want you to chair this committee, Petty Officer Thompson. It will be an additional duty, with appropriate recognition for the responsibility involved. Admiral Chen handed him the new document. This is a formal appointment, along with a letter of recommendation for advancement that reflects your knowledge of base operations and your leadership potential. Marcus stared at the papers in his hands, unable to fully process what he was reading. A week ago, he had been a petty officer known mainly for pranks and practical jokes. Now he was being offered a position that would give him direct access to the commanding officer and the ability to influence base policies affecting thousands of personnel. Ma'am, he said slowly, I'm not sure I'm qualified for this kind of responsibility. Admiral Chen laughed. The same genuine laugh that had surprised everyone during their first encounter. Petty Officer Thompson, qualification isn't just about rank or formal training. It's about understanding the people you serve with and being willing to advocate for their needs. This past week has convinced me that you have both qualities. She stood up and walked around the desk to face Marcus. That bucket of soapy water last Monday was the best thing that could have happened to my transition to this command. It broke down barriers that might have taken months to overcome and gave me insights I never would have gained through official channels. Marcus stood as well, still holding the appointment documents. What you're saying, ma'am, is that my biggest mistake turned out to be accidentally useful? What I'm saying, Petty Officer Thompson, is that sometimes the most important leadership lessons come from the most unexpected places. You taught me something about this base and its people that no briefing could have conveyed. Now I'm asking you to help me use that knowledge to make things better for everyone. Admiral Chen extended her hand for a handshake. Welcome to the team, Committee Chairman Thompson. As Marcus shook her hand, he reflected on the extraordinary week that had followed his moment of spectacular poor judgment. The incident that should have ended his career had instead opened doors he never knew existed and given him opportunities to make a real difference in the lives of his fellow sailors. 6 months later, Marcus would be promoted to Petty Officer First Class, in large part due to his work with the Enlisted Advisory Committee. The base would implement all of the improvements Admiral Chen had identified during their week together, resulting in measurably higher morale and retention rates. The story of the bucket incident would become legendary throughout the Navy, shared in leadership courses as an example of how unconventional situations could create unexpected opportunities for both growth and positive change. But all of that was still in the future. For now, Marcus simply stood in Admiral Chen's office, holding documents that represented a second chance and a new beginning, marveling at how a moment of spectacular misjudgment had somehow transformed into the most important week of his naval career.